Okay. Yesterday, yesterday the way we began this was to suggest that for some of us, Illich was important because he shed light on the contemporary condition, predicament, situation. And we left it open, and we thought, and I left it open without specifying what that might be. And overnight, I think it might be useful to stage the morning's conversation, or prompt the morning's conversation with a brief preface on what that might be. It seems to me, without getting into the question of why that is, it seems to me just as a matter of phenomenon, whether it's from Beijing to Boston, Sao Paulo to San Francisco. Technology, experimental science, liberal democracy as an ideal, if not a fact, production separated from consumption in the sphere of economics. So you have economics, politics, and the relationship to the world through techno-scientific understandings and things. And this seems to be common by the 21st century, regardless of where you go. And there are a clutch of thinkers, in my understanding, in my limited knowledge of things, of people. There are only a few people who have asked this question: why is that? Why is it when you go to a slum in Bombay, or you sit in in Cambridge, in Boston, etc., it's roughly speaking the same ideational space of ideas in the spheres of economics, politics, and the relationship to the world. And so that was the motivation to open this up, or to create this little book launch and seminar, to bring to attention a man who's, regardless of what the answer might be, who's posed that question. And I think one of the few people who posed that question at that scale. And so with that limited introduction, again, to saying why I think, and some of us, I think, agree, of the importance of Illich, a man who's asked, in our opinion, an important question, a broad question, a question that affects more than just us in a room. And it is with that intention that we engage now in a two-part, today in a two-part seminar. The first deals with the question of political theology. Paraphrased very, very summarily, and Wolfgang knows it all, does an excellent job, and I'm looking forward to listening and learning today. There was an old teacher of mine, Strauss, who's reviled in certain circles, Leo Strauss, who in conversation with others said, the great struggle in Western political life is to ask the following question: by what principle do you organize the political? What is the one thing needful? To which politics is an answer. And you have two answers, theological and political, if you want. And hence, stitching together the phrase political theology is pregnant. It asks what some have thought to be a permanent question. And with that said, Wolfgang, you can lead us through the thicket of political theology.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
You got 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be invited to explore a little bit the deeper problems connected to political theology, or the religio-political science, or the relationship between the religion and politics, which is a very complex one. And if one does not understand the complexity of the relationship between those two things, then one easily falls in this or that trap. In some way, I'm very much against what the students of Strauss, not you, but some of the more prominent students were able to convince more or less the whole academia, and I think it's misleading completely. So I start with that, and then I will go a little bit deeper into some substantial questions of political theology or religio-political science. I want to start with this is a first attack on certain Straussian thinking. One of the prominent Straussians who wrote a book that was discussed all over, at least in the Western world, is Mark Liller's book of 2007, The Great Separation. And he says, at the time of Thomas Hobbes, religion and politics were separated. And he also, following Strauss, although I'm not always sure if those students of Strauss are really good Straussians, but I'm not a Straussian myself to be really able to understand that. But Liller makes it quite easy, similar to Heinrich Meyer, who is one of the prominent students of Carl Schmitt, and I have to address also Carl Schmitt when we talk about political theology. They make a little bit a cheap distinction that they say we have on the one hand political theology, and political theology is just to be obedient to the law of God and develop and unfold politics according what this obedient following of the commandment of God recommends. So it's nothing but stupid obedience, political theology. And over against that, they juxtapose political philosophy, which means to arrange and organize politics according to human insights, with human reason, with human philosophy. But does it work? I mean, on the first sight, and many people, when they read Liller or Heinrich Meyer, they are completely convinced, yeah, that's a good thing, and so we can distinguish and separate ourselves from fundamentalists who are stupidly following some kind of scripture and want to have a one-to-one recipe coming from what they read in the scripture and then apply it to the realm of politics. So, on the first sight we can agree, but then we have to think, is it possible? That's the first important question. Is it possible to separate religion and politics in a really fundamental sense and in a real separation? And I would say it's not possible. There is no political philosophy who does not depend in a broad sense on suppositions that you have to follow in some way, as a fundamentalist probably follows some kind of scripture. And there is no political theologian or even fundamentalist who doesn't need to have a certain kind of reason to make something out of scripture if it's transferred to politics. So this cheap distinction sounds nice at first sight, but it's wrong, because we cannot separate religion from politics. Which does not mean that this leads to an easy conclusion or easy relationship of those two things. It's just not possible to separate. And I will give two quotes in order to, I could give three quotes, but I don't give three quotes. The first quote would be Eric Voegelin, who is one of the founders of so-called religio-political science, who always insisted you cannot separate. But I will turn to a famous German writer, to Thomas Mann, who lived a couple of years in Princeton, just opposite to the place where I'm currently working. And I was for many years also studying Mann, because he has something to say about those things. He succumbed to certain bad understandings of this realm, but also understand, because of his own failure, what we have to understand. So Thomas Mann said, religion and politics are not completely different. I quote, "We fail to recognize the indivisibility of the world when we think of religion and politics as fundamentally separate fields which neither have nor should have anything to do with each other, to the extent even that the one would be devalued and exposed as false if any trace of the other were to be found in it." The second quote is from a thinker or activist, which is also important, who is also important for Illich and was mentioned already yesterday, Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi is writing, Mahatma Gandhi was not someone who thought you should have a fundamentalist type of India, so politically Mahatma Gandhi was in favor of a secular Indian state, even secular Indian schools without state schools, without religious education by one denomination. Nevertheless, he really fought a fight against the simplified view one can separate religion from politics. I quote, "I could not live for a single second without religion. Many of my political friends despair of me because they say that even my politics are derived from my religion. And they are right. My politics and all other activities of mine are derived from my religion. I go further and say that every activity of a man of religion must be derived from his religion, because religion means being bound to God, that is to say, God rules your every breath. If you recognize that truth, naturally God regulates every activity of yours." And I think this is a very pertinent insight, and beyond understanding Illich a little bit better, I mean, in Europe currently we have a big debate about religion and politics and the relationship of it in regard to Muslims. So when the Muslim migrants 3 years ago came from Syria and Afghanistan and all over the place, some journalists and sociologists of religion and other people tried to get interviews with them. I mean, there were language problems, and the people were exhausted and had other things to do than to give interviews to this Western kind of questions. So they were asked, is for you God and the commandments of God more important or democracy? And if these people are religious people, they would respond like Gandhi. They would say, of course, for my life, for the deeper meaning of my life, God and religion is more important. So the journalists and those who do the interviews note that, and then the next day you have a big headline, dangerous fundamentalists coming to Austria and overcoming all the things. And it's a stupid thing, because I as a Catholic say, as far as I'm a religious person, of course I try to follow in a deeper sense these deeper religious insights, and of course is religion more important for me than what the current government in Austria does. That does not mean that I do not obey red lights at a junction. I mean, because that's the thing, that the people think that those religious people, if they do not have a commandment to stop at red light, they will just do not follow all the rules that in Austria are important. I follow the rules as far as possible, pay my taxes and so on, but I do not think that those laws are more important than the deeper religious insights. So now I turn to the more central question, but this introduction is important for me, because in that sense you cannot say that religion and politics can be separated. But that does not automatically mean that every kind of political theology is already a proper answer. We have to look now a little bit in the complexity of the relationship between religion and politics. And I will do it in maybe 3 steps. I will say a little bit about the term political theology in the modern world, because you can go back until Augustine and even before and have a very interesting hour on political theology, how it developed in the Western world, but we cannot do that. But I will just give a flashlight on political theology in the Western world, at least in the 20th century. In a second step, I will look at some more substantial questions from an Illichian point of view, how the biblical revelation relates to what scientists today call parochial altruism. And I will say something on the parable of the Good Samaritan with the help of Illich. And in the third step, I will talk about also a concept that is in a broader sense a concept of political theology, but I do not call it political theology, I call it theological politics, and I will explain why. And the main thesis of my whole talk is that also Illich cannot and will not separate religion from politics, but not in the sense of political theology, but more in the sense of theological politics. So, first step, political theology. The term political theology in the 20th century is deeply connected to Carl Schmitt. And even the Straussians followed in that regard to a certain degree Carl Schmitt, because Strauss was a student of Schmitt and took some of the insights from Schmitt. And Schmitt published in 1922, he was a German infamous law thinker that became, after 33 until at least 38, very much committed to National Socialism and Adolf Hitler, which complicates for us the whole thing, because when you make cheap judgments about Schmitt, it's easy to say Schmitt is finished and it's completely wrong because he was a Nazi is an easy go, but doesn't help us at all to understand the things more properly. So he published a book in 1922 when he was definitely not a Nazi, and he was not a Nazi until Hitler came into power. He was very opportunist, and so why should you be a Nazi before you see that they are victorious? But afterwards, there were many people who said, let's join the wagon, the train, because this is more prosperous than to be locked up or whatever. So Schmitt in 1922 published a small book, Political Theology, in which he emphasized that it is important to understand political, juridical concepts by exploring analogies between the world of politics and the world of religion. So the famous sentence of one of the key chapters of the book is famously quoted, quote, "All significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of their systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts." So he says, for instance, the concept of the exception in jurisprudence, something very important also for Agamben, is analogous to the miracle in theology, and so on. So this is some kind of important insight with Schmitt. That's not completely right, the whole thing, and it's very complex to go a little bit deeper. But it's an observation you cannot easily push from the table, and still people think around those things and so on. A year later, that's important, and more important even in view of even Illich, he published a book in 1923, Roman Catholicism and Political Form. And in this book, he claims that the Catholic Church is a world historical form of power. And for this second book, he got the approval of the Catholic Church. So it was a book published with imprimatur. That means that the Catholic Church says this is true teaching. And it's not so far away, because in the introduction to this now new book of Illich, Agamben refers to the introduction of the Feast of King the Christ in 1925, which is a little bit close to what Schmitt said in Roman Catholicism and Political Form. It was also the nearly futile attempt to make Jesus great again in the world of politics. It's really, I mean, it really was that attempt in 1925. Maybe there was a little bit more into that, and I would have to study it, but just the formula that Agamben quotes in the in the introduction shows, there is really a close affinity, and which is a problem that I will quickly say, because if you read this small book of Carl Schmitt, and I think it was one of the first books I read, and whenever I read it, I get excited because I mean, Schmitt was a very powerful writer in the way he wrote, very seductive, with very interesting allusions, but also in the way very wrong, but in a very significant way wrong. So he says in this book, where he praises the power of the Catholic Church, he praises Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor. It was mentioned already yesterday. He praises it, and he said Dostoevsky was wrong. Dostoevsky, when he wrote this story of the Grand Inquisitor, was just projecting his own atheism into this figure. So, I mean, how many people do you know, thinkers, who dare to side with the Grand Inquisitor? Schmitt did that. A little bit Hannah Arendt, actually. Hannah Arendt also dares to say, well, we should take the Grand Inquisitor more seriously. But Schmitt fully supports the Grand Inquisitor. The second thing is a little bit a complex concept of the New Testament. In the new, not in the new, in the second letter of Paul, it was not Paul, but in the following of St. Paul, in the second letter to the Thessalonians, there is a very strange concept developed. The Greek word of this concept is katechon, and it means the restrainer. So in this, the first letter to the Thessalonians, that's the first document of the New Testament, the oldest document we have in the New Testament from the year 50. So that was really the first earliest document, and it was fully, this document was fully in the expectation of the second coming of Christ immediately. So if you think that Christ would come tomorrow, or let's say a week after tomorrow, our lives would dramatically change, right? For instance, I wouldn't have to worry how get I my Princeton luggage into my 2 suitcases and what I have to do and what kind of Christmas presents I have to buy here or arrange that they are there. And so many questions that burden me right now would disappear. And probably I wouldn't finish my paper I'm writing in Princeton, and I would have a nicer day tomorrow. The day after tomorrow, then...
And I don't have to send you your travel reimbursement.
Yeah, so it would be a win-win situation. I wouldn't worry about that at all. So we have to take that seriously, that the early Christians really thought and prayed and hoped that Christ will come tomorrow. And, but this led also to troubles and problems, because the people get lazy, the people said, why should I consider what comes tomorrow, and so on. So the second letter of Thessalonians tried to respond to this little bit too strong enthusiasm. So in the second letter of Thessalonians, it is said, before Christ the Messiah comes again, there will be, according to the apocalyptic expectations of Scripture, a huge catastrophe. And this catastrophe does not break out as long as the restrainer, whoever that is, prevents the outbreak of the catastrophe, and also prevents indirectly, which is a more difficult thing, the coming of Christ. And so the katechon is very close to Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, because the Grand Inquisitor says to Jesus, as David yesterday said, go away, don't come again, you are disturbing the things. We have set up everything nicely and everything runs smoothly, and you are just destroying the thing. And Schmitt liked this insight very much, and politically it's an interesting insight, and all the more, all the thinkers who understood those things quite well, as Strauss, as Voegelin, as Schmitt, were very much worried about the deeper substance of the gospel, because it makes political order already well established and nicely organized puts those things into trouble. But in the biblical legacy, there is an anarchic stream impulse, which is a little bit bustling and worrying thinkers of order. And Schmidt was a thinker of order, and maybe this guy who wrote the second letter to the Thessalonians was also more in favor of order than a possibility of crisis. So the interesting thing is, if you, I think it's the first letter of the Corinthians, and it's even the ending of the New Testament. If you look to those two texts, they all end up with the really deep hope for Christ's coming again, with the call and cry, Maranatha. And this is now Illich, because in the book we have here, Illich very much emphasizes this cry and claim for Maranatha. But it's just the opposite to the Katechon, the opposite to the and I may run out a little bit of time, but I have to tell you a story which is so funny, but so striking to understand what I'm telling about. I was from 2013 to 2017 the dean of our Catholic school, so I had to go to some special events. So the Neo-Apostolic Church, I don't know if you have ever heard of that church, it's quite widely spread all over the world, is part of 19th century development, actually in England, of people who read the Bible again very carefully, a little bit similar to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and discovered this spirit of immediate second coming. So again and again in the church history, those groups pop up because they read the thing and said, well, there is a longing for a second coming quite soon, not very far into the future. And this is one of those groups, a nice group, and they had a big mass in Innsbruck, and all over Europe their members came, and they are very open for interreligious dialogue, so I was invited there, and I was seated next to the mayor of Innsbruck at that time, a lady, very nice lady, and I was just sitting next to her, and I introduced myself. I said, I'm dean of the School of Theology, and she said, I'm the mayor. I said, of course I know that you are the mayor of Innsbruck. And then she said, you know, I prepared myself for this service today, and I read, they believe in a second coming of Christ. And I had about 30 seconds where I said nothing, and then I said, Mrs. Mayor, we Catholics too. Then she said, yeah, but not really in that sense. No, I said, really in that sense. But I can at least admit the Catholics would be much more surprised if it happened tomorrow as is community over here. So this is just, you know, the Catholic Church has now moved on for centuries or 2 millennia, and the hot longing, the really hot longing for the second coming has a little bit calmed down. So calmed down that a vaguely Catholic Christian Democrat mayor is not really expecting second coming at all. And this is at stake in the whole discussion. Schmidt, someone who really was, for political reasons, very much in favor of postponing the second coming and keeping up order with the Katechon as long as possible. And Illich is just the other way around. So Illich in some way, not in the probably more fundamentalist version, but he's a thinker who tries to kindle the early flame of the second coming. So a short word to new political theology. In the 60s and 70s, and I think that's in the background, and there's a little distance you can recognize in Illich's writing. There came a left-wing political theology with the famous names Johann Baptist Metz, Jürgen Moltmann, Dorothee Sölle, who for good reasons said in favor of social justice, in favor of criticism of oppression, in siding with victims, theologians have to address those issues. They cannot just address religious things. But immediately the discussion was, well, if you now create a political theology, that was the term they took up for their new attempt, you are Schmittian, and this is very dangerous, he became a Nazi and all these things. Then they said, no, we are talking about a new political theology. So not in the following of Schmitt, but in the following Metz, for instance. The whole work of Metz is completely shaped by his experience in the Second World War and by the reflection, what does Auschwitz mean. He talks about the memoria passionis, the remembering of the suffering of others as a central piece. And they also very strongly emphasize on social justice. There is a strong connection between that kind of thinking, for instance, and René Girard, who also said the biblical legacy is a legacy that for the first time in human history very strongly emphasized the importance to side with victims of violence, oppression, and whatever. But there is a problem with all types of political theology, and one can call it the Constantinian temptation. That means there is always the temptation, and I would say Illich is fundamentally aware of this temptation, and so if you read this new book, you would say, how could Palaver talk about political theology in regard to Illich? This was what Illich really attacked and criticized and didn't like at all, for good reasons. And that's true, but as I said in the very beginning, that doesn't mean that not also Illich is a political theologian in the broader sense, because he understood from his deeper theological convictions and his being a member of the church, that living as a Christian shapes society, or can shape society. So in that sense it's a political theology, but not in the sense of seeking power and aligning immediately with the state and take over the state and dominate. And this is the danger of political theology. I mean, when I started studying theology in 1979, I was fully on the side of new political theology, and I still am in some way on the side. So Johann Baptist Metz just turned 90 in August this year, and I was one of maybe 200 contributors to a huge festschrift. So I learned a lot from Metz, and I would not easily push those these insights aside. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the Constantinian temptation, and I can give a very good example that we left-wing new political theologians where we have to confront, for instance, today. I think a year after I started studying Innsbruck, we were all engaged in Latin America, anti-apartheid and those things. So we were very enthusiastic about the ongoing revolution in Nicaragua. And when 1 or 2 years after I started theology, Ernesto Cardinal was invited by the then Social Democratic Chancellor Bruno Kreisky in Vienna. We hired a Volkswagen bus, a little bit, 5 of us, and we drove to Vienna and were part of a huge lecture of Cardinal and were completely committed. But when you see now the situation of Nicaragua today, you know, what is the name of the president there? Ortega. Yeah, he was part of this revolution, and in a very. But as soon as such revolutions take over state power and try to prolong power and keep in power, they are easily endangered to use after a couple of years the same methods the oppressors used against them. So this is the temptation of political theology. If you put politics first and just try to find in theology support for what you want to achieve politically. And against that we can think about theological politics this is a little bit closer to a very important American theologian, Stanley Hauerwas, and also some of his very good students. One of the best students of Hauerwas is probably, from my point of view, one of the most important theologians in the United States now. It's William Cavanaugh, and I was very glad to see that he wrote an endorsement, a blurb for this Illich book.
Thanks.
I was not aware of him, that he was reading Illich and even connected to Illich, Cavanaugh, because I know him quite well and collaborating for a couple
Thanks
of years.
to David.
Yeah, so these theologians are now also politically, socially engaged and committed, but not so much that they seek immediately to take over the state and then make nice theological steps forward with the help of the means of the state, but thinking much stronger what the church, what we as communities have to do to shape the world in a better direction. One could give an example, just that you see what Illich does is close to one of the important thinkers that's today supported by theological politics, Hauerwas, Cavanaugh, but also Illich, as I saw, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his letters from prison, he wrote an outline of a future book that he couldn't, of course, write because he was killed by the Nazis soon afterwards. He writes about a servant church. The church is church only when it is there for others. As a first step, it must give away all its property to those in need. The clergy must live solely on the free will offerings of the congregations and perhaps be engaged in some secular vocation. The church must participate in worldly tasks of life in the community, not dominating, but helping and serving. It must tell people in every calling what a life with Christ is, what it means to be there for others. In particular, our church will have to confront the vices of hubris, the worship of power, envy, and illusionism as the roots of all evil. It will have to speak of moderation, authenticity, trust, faithfulness, steadfastness, patience, discipline, humility, modesty, contentment. It will have to see that it does not underestimate the significance of the human example. And I think if you every sentence of this fits completely what I found out in the most striking essays in Illich's books. And Stanley Hauerwas, for instance, in his Gifford lectures, I think published with the title "The Grain of the Universe," he has a huge chapter on Bonhoeffer where he emphasizes this attitude. So I come to my second insight, and I do it rather quickly, and then we can discuss it if it was not clear enough. I will give an example in what way the biblical message challenges political order, and for good, but also with a lot of confusion. And this is, I will talk a little bit about parochial altruism and Illich's understanding of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Recently, scientists, I mean, the things were published in Nature, so one of the leading journals of today. Samuel Bowles, economist, you must know him also, critical, coming from the left, economist, but he wrote a very interesting book, and they did also interesting experiments, and were reacting a little bit against the neoliberal claim that dominated the last 40 years, that human beings are prone for competition, and everything is competition, and there is no cooperation, no competition. And more scientists today, the last 20 years, said this is completely wrong. Human beings are deeply cooperative beings. They are even super cooperators. But there is a downside to it, and this downside is grasped by the concept parochial altruism, because they found out, and you can find it out if you study early human beginnings, but you can also find it out if you reflect on the state of populism and nationalism and making things great again in our world, because we human beings are most likely in solidarity with others if we are in a group against another group. So if we are in a group against another group, many of us would even give up their life for our group in the battle against another group. And this is parochial altruism. We human beings are prone to altruism, but this type of altruism is more likely if it is setting in a friend-enemy group against group settings. This was already observed by Charles Darwin. This was clearly understood by Henri Bergson, who is the famous thinker who coined the term closed society and open society, much more, much deeper than the later version of Karl Popper. So, parochial altruism is also the concept of the welfare state of the 20th century. And the more you have globalization, that means the more you make it more fluid, what does it mean to be an Austrian, American, a Canadian, whatever, the more it's also questionable, do I pay taxes for a state who is not clearly formed? And so we probably are ready to pay state for our nation that we are also supporting patriotically, but can you do it for the whole world and so on? I mean, these are tricky questions. These are tricky questions, and you can see in some way from the 17th century onwards, the best attempt to overcome the economic troubles and human troubles coming from strengthening competition was the welfare state, which was, however, also a nation state and easily coming to be a nationalist state. One could go a little bit deeper into that. So the welfare state and the nation state are strongly connected, and therefore it's also very interesting today in Europe to see that the right-wing nationalists, they take both arguments seriously. They say, well, Austrians should be first, and we have poor Austrians, and they have to get our Austrian money, and well, if there is some money left over, we can give it to Syrian migrants, but shouldn't we give it to Austrians first? And this is not completely wrong. I mean, it's not my position, but it's a position, it's more natural, under quotation marks, and it takes up votes, and people more and more, even liberals, and you even see it in the United States here. A columnist in the New York Times I like very much, David Brooks, recently said, yeah, we have to have nationalism in some way, in a good way. And the problem of the Democrats is they do not understand this problem. I mean, however, he also says Trump is not a nationalist because he doesn't really be in solidarity with all in America, in the United States. But these are the troubles that have to do with that. And you can say the biblical message, the message of Jesus, was really challenging parochial altruism. He did it in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, it was said to you, or you know all traditionally, love your friends and hate your enemies. But I say to you, it's otherwise. And he is not addressing some kind of wrong understanding of Judaism. Christians for centuries always thought Jesus is here criticizing the narrow-minded Jews. Even in the beginning of the 20th century, there was in Germany a debate. Jewish scholars said, no, this is not our teaching. And Christians said, no, you are narrow-minded. And then later on they killed them to get rid of narrow-mindedness. But it was the Christians who were really cruelly narrow-minded. Jesus also challenged parochial altruism in the parable of the Samaritan, because We do not understand that parable very well today because the Samaritan has become, because of this story and the legacy of this story, a very good example. So everybody wants to be a Samaritan. It's a good term. But when Jesus used this term, it was a very bad term. It was yesterday David referred to it already, and Illich said it was like a Palestinian helping Israeli, or I would say, in order really to understand it today, a Hamas fighter, a fundamentalist Hamas fighter, is given by Jesus as an example to his Israeli community what a good person, how a good person should react. And if you understand this political religious enmity that was behind the Samaritan, you understand that the listeners to Jesus said, he's really overdoing that. I mean, this is not a good thing on the long term. So you see, in the biblical tradition, there's really a deep challenge to one of the patterns that are so prone to us. And even after 2,000 years of Christianity and maybe 4,000 years or whatever of biblical legacy, because you have also in the Hebrew Bible a strong criticism of parochial altruism, if you read it carefully and not with superiority claims of Christianity. And you have it also in the other axial world religions. But all these religions fight against a pattern that is very deep-rooted, and currently we can just observe it pops up all over the place. It's so much a challenge. So Illich pointed that very much out, that he said, the story marks a significant break with all forms of ethics that are based on a special care of one's own family, group, or race. And, well, Illich says more about the parable. He has different, but one of the important insights is that he really says this is a revolutionary concept. Now, how it used and how it then later on became institutionalized with all the other problems, that's one of the important insights of Illich that I will not go deeper into it. I'm coming to my, do I have 10 more minutes to my third and last point, where with the help of Illich I will talk about the theological politics of a pilgrim church, and following up a little bit on parochial altruism. And actually, I'm not absolutely really fan of Agamben. Maybe I've become one. I've always struggled when I, as a Girardian, read Homo Sacer. I said, how can he write this book and not mentioning Girard at all? This is outrageous. So that was my first thing, and I'm still wondering and do not understand that. But 2 or 3 years ago, I was working on this parochial altruism. And as a theologian, maybe not immediately, but quite soon, I said, I mean, isn't it strange that in the center of the biblical message there is a deep challenge of parochialism? But if you think 10 seconds about where does the word parochial come from? It's the parish. So how can it be that the term, actually the Latin term of parish, became in anthropology and social science the key term for narrow-mindedness? That has something to do with a church or a Christendom that didn't really follow the message, but followed more political and social usual patterns, right? But then I learned from Agamben, and he has to be praised where he has to be praised. I read Agamben's book, The Church and the Kingdom, which is, for what I'm saying now, very important. I read this book, and suddenly I really had a moment of really enlightenment, because he understands perfectly well. So the Latin term of the Latin Church of Christendom led to the term parochial as we use it. And I mean, for a German-speaking person, you are not so aware, but you cannot read a good newspaper where the term parochial doesn't pop up every day, right? It's a very common term. It's not so common. In German, we also say parochial, but the people do not understand it, but you understand it. So the Latin term of church Christendom led to the term who means socially, politically narrow-minded. But the Latin term parochial goes back to paroikoi in Greek. And this is a term you find all over the place in the New Testament. And it's not narrow-mindedness at all, it's something completely different. And then you can again ask yourselves, why has this term and this self-understanding of early Christians become a modern social concept meaning narrow-mindedness? And the term paroikia means sojourning, means life of a resident alien, because the Christians, in following the Jewish tradition, understood themselves as they are engaged in society, but they are not really part of this world. They are resident aliens, helping the common good of the cities they are living in, stopping at red lights, going only when there is green light, so doing what is required to do, but not really of this world in a complete rooted sense of this blood and soil rootedness, but aliens who live there. This is the term. And Agamben says this understanding of Christians as pilgrims in this world, you find it, for instance, also very central in the teachings of Augustine. Agamben rightly says, this understanding of early Christians as being pilgrims in this world, as being resident aliens in this world, is very close to what he understands as messianic time. It's very close to Jewish messianism. Paroikia and parousia, the expectation of the Messiah, those terms are very close. The sojourn of the foreigner and the presence of the Messiah is the time of the end. And the time of the end, Illich was very much aware of that. So Illich is really, and maybe Agamben also understood it because of Illich. So if you read Illich, and if you read just good theological literature on those key terms in the New Testament, that goes completely together. It's again this early Christian understanding of an immediate coming of or longing for the coming of the Messiah that we most of the time have lost. And one of the means to postpone the Messiah is institutionalization. So we create big institutions in order to settle in and no longer sojourn. And so let me just quote Agamben. With the eclipse of the messianic experience of the culmination of the law and of time comes an unprecedented hypertrophy of law, one that, under the guise of legislating everything, betrays its legitimacy through legalistic excess. I mean, think about, I think Alistair McIntyre said, law books in the modern societies in the last decades, or maybe centuries, decades, exploded. You know, more and more things we think we have to regulate, and we need new laws, new rules, and so on. And he said the explosion and the really growth of law books is an indirect sign of the civil war going on in our societies. This is what Agamben calls the hypertrophy of law or the legalistic excess. I think that's again very close to what Illich understood about institutionalization. Another quote from, this is really striking, from Agamben. According to Christian theology, there is only one legal institution which knows neither interruption nor end. And I mean, the katechon is the attempt to have no interruption and no end. And Agamben says it's hell. Only the hell has this permanency. And theologically it's not
theologically seen, the hell is not the proper place to be, right?
But his interpretation is correct.
Yeah, yeah.
That the hell is the continuation without end.
Yeah. So this is again, I should have said that to the mayor of Innsbruck. Are you in favor of hell? I mean, let me read one quote, because of course I'm also getting reimbursement from my friend because I have to do some advertisement for this book, I suppose. No, that's a joke. On page 159 in the new book, there is a striking quotation which just has the same insight as Agamben. Illich wrote, "We can speak about the church in the past tense, and we can enjoy her as mother, as spouse, and as a corrupt woman, a prostitute in the present, accepting her gratefully, joyfully, shamefully, recognizing ourselves as what we are, sons of that kind of a woman. But only in the present, the Lord redeems her. We have no idea if there is a future. To live as Christians means to live in the spirit of the Maranatha, the Lord is coming at this moment. It means to live and to enjoy living at the edge of time, at the end moment of time." And this understanding is again the early Christians who said, Jesus was already here, so the end is here, and we have to live according to this end. But this is not the same spirit as the organization of the catechontic big institution and orders that are more prone to turn the world into a hell in some way, although we have to be careful not to. So Illich is very close to this spirit. His understanding of the church is a church as a pilgrim church. He saw himself as a wandering Jew and Christian pilgrim. What I really like when you read Illich, he was so strong. It's also in the book when he says Rabbi Yeshua ben Yosef. So he understands Jesus really in the spirit of Jewish messianism, opening up and also opening up to Muslims. So this pilgrimage versus institutionalization could be a key concept if I would only have 1 minute and not going on for 2 hours, but I will finish soon. Illich said we should live a life of trust and not of institutionalization of the future, of trying to grasp the future. We should live here and now, trustfully, and not put all our trust in planning of the future. And planning of the future, this futile attempt to everything get into order, and forgetting that we die, and so therefore most of the plans then are for nothing anyway. He says this complete trust in human planning is a new variety of the sin of pride. It's a new variety of the sin of pride. A false messianism that no longer trusts in God. And it's really striking if you read his seminal book, The Schooling Society. He talks about human attempts to organize the mechanical Messiah. So the mechanical Messiah is the incarnation of this kind of false relation to the Messiah. So he talks about Promethean fallacy on the one side, and Christian hope on the other. So the church is not called to organize herself in this spirit of Carl Schmitt's Roman Catholicism and political form. The first vocation of the church is to celebrate the mystery. And if you understand that correctly, then we can also understand why Illich criticized political theology. Illich said it is blasphemous to use the gospel to prop up any social or political system. It's blasphemous. The church has to follow the example of Jesus, which has political consequences, because I said in the beginning you cannot separate these two realms. But it does not mean to immediately organize it or have some kind of political concepts and then try to get as much gospel energy into my political project. That's already a corruption of the whole thing. And I said the Nicaragua example is an example that I can use as a critical mirror for myself, because we have to face, with enthusiasm we supported the revolution there, but it was this kind of using the gospel for a political system. Illich emphasized against that grace and being a hopeful pilgrim. What is a different concept? So he's closer to theological politics in the sense of Hauerwas and Kavanaugh. Although where is Metz? I mean, I don't want to make cheap distinctions. I mean, but we should be aware as theologians. I mean, in the United States, although there are other problems linked now to this person, John Howard Yoder is also a very important thinker in regard of a political theology, more in the realm of theological politics. Of course, in his case, because of being a Mennonite, because the Mennonites and those early churches, they understood that already in the 16th, 17th century. The Catholics needed against, some Catholics recognized this in the 60s of the 20th century, but it's still the battle about Pope Francis currently in the Catholic Church is also very close to those issues, because he is not so much concerned in organizing everything, and all those who are in position and have their claims and their interests, they are worried because they said now the head of the church is undermining it. If you read Carl Schmitt's Roman Catholicism and Political Form, you will come across a sentence where Schmitt says the church, I think I have it here, the church is representing, where is it? The church commands recognition as the bride of Christ. The church represents Christ reigning, Christ ruling, and Christ conquering. Christ reigning, Christ ruling, and Christ conquering. And as I said, Schmitt got a church approval for this book. So the guys who had to decide if this good church teaching or not said this is good Catholicism, strong, and today you would say this is robust Catholicism, right? Robust Catholicism. But this is not Illich's understanding. Again, a quote from Illich's book, page 161. Illich says, I do believe that the time is dawning again when many Christians realize the implications or identifying with the crucified Lord, with whom, who was truly man, believed truly in an omnipotent God, and made himself totally subject to a gallows. So if you compare this quote with Carl Schmitt, then you see the difference between political theology in the Schmittian sense and the theological politics as we can find out here. The church as a community of pilgrims living in a time of the end, that is the core of theological politics understood with Illich's eyes. And I conclude with one quote about a vision of the church that just supports what I said. Illich writes in 1967, I think that's not in the book, but I don't know, maybe it's also in the book. Let's say it's also in the book. It's also in the book. Hoping to glory in the works of our hands, we feel guilty, frustrated and angry when part of the building starts to crumble. Hoping to glory in the works of our hands, we feel guilty, frustrated and angry when part of the building starts to crumble, when our plans do not work out. Instead of believing in the church, we frantically attempt to construct it according to our own cloudy cultural image. We want to build community relying on techniques and are blind to the latent desire for unity that is striving to express itself among men. In fear, we plan our church with statistics rather than trustingly search for the living church which is right among us. And if I would have had the book before and more time to prepare, I would say in the center is his understanding that the church, we as members of the church, are called to love in loving communities, and by doing that we would contribute much more to a good development of our world than all our plannings to create political concepts could achieve. Thank you very much.
Wolfgang, I think one takes a deep breath before, first to thank you for a masterful, not only summary, I think the contrast you set up, which you mentioned yesterday, it comes to full view in your presentation today, between political theology and theological politics, efficiently summarizes and puts into sharp relief the tension between what is popularly understood as the relation between, let's say, in your language, religion and politics, and perhaps a more theologically infused understanding of the role of politics for let's say, the world of Illich. And I don't want to ask the first question, though I have two or three.
May I start?
Please. Michael, go.
No. I just have a quick question, a factual question I want to ask, because I have to remember the bathroom. Right. William Kavanaugh, did he ever teach at Syracuse University in New York?
I don't think so. I mean,
not to my knowledge.
He was teaching at St. Thomas for a very long time. He was a doctoral student of Powerless.
Ah.
So he's Catholic, but he was a doctoral student of Powerless at Duke, and he did a very interesting. And so there is a link to Illich in this regard also. His dissertation became a seminal book called Torture and the Eucharist, and was a careful investigation of dictatorship and religion and politics in Chile, the Pinochet regime. And I can tell more if you're interested about that book, because that book, maybe I say a sentence to the book, because it goes also in that direction. He says in that book, he talks about torture and the Eucharist, and he says, when modern state uses torture, does he try to get information of those people that are tortured that the state doesn't have in other ways? He said no. The main aim of torture is not to get any kind of information in this utilitarian understanding. The main aim of torture is to destroy trust between people, because tortured people, when they go home, even their families say maybe he has done something and so on. If you read George Orwell's 1984, it also ends with the torture of this guy Smith and his girlfriend. And after they are both released, they split up because he's so much tortured. He's so anxious of rats. He's in a cage, and then they threaten and when he had the thought or the cry, "Let's my girlfriend have between the rats and me that I am safe," he can no longer.
Illich comments on that.
Yeah, do you know his book ABC?
Yes.
Yeah, where he writes at length about Orwell.
I know.
And the precise scene.
Yeah, I have to look it up. So the state that tortures destroys usual organic relationships between people in order to make the individualization of the people even stronger, and then the people are completely relying on the state, and then the state can organize the people. And the deep insight is, this is not only a problem of Pinochet, this is the problem of the modern state in general. If you read, I got that also from Kavanaugh, if you read Rousseau, the famous Le Contrat Social, the social contract. Rousseau says the relationship between the people among themselves should be as weak as possible, and the relationship of every individual to the center of the state as strong as possible. And so he juxtaposes Kavanaugh the Eucharist, because he says this kind of atomization of the people by torture is a kind of a perverse liturgy, and he compares that with a profound liturgy as it is lived in the Eucharist. So that's his seminal dissertation. And then he was teaching in systematic theology in St. Thomas, and a couple of years he moved to DePaul University in Chicago.
Okay.
And he wrote a letter of recommendation that I could go in Princeton, so I have to be a little bit advertising.
You can carry on the conversation when you come back.
Yeah, I just want to drop one line. Doesn't this sound, this tension, sound a lot like the tension between Hobbes and Spinoza? Spinoza says, look, yeah, we need the state, absolutely. I mean, people tear each other apart. On the other hand, I cannot give up my humanity to the state, which is what Hobbes' war against all and absolute subordination to the Leviathan means.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you very much.
That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. And especially, I think it's clarifying to think of Illich as anti-Schmidt, the anti-Schmidt.
Yeah.
Especially since they're so similar in many
Yeah.
ways. If you read many, I mean, reading
And
Meyer,
Balkan leanings.
reading Meyer on,
Yeah.
in the lesson of Carl Schmitt, and he has a very extended quotation from Schmitt, which could have been Illich. Not on any of these questions,
Yeah.
but on the analysis of what is going on
Yeah.
in his society.
So there are also similarities.
Yeah, that's
For instance,
that's why it's so
explosion of the law, this
Hypertrophy.
hypertrophy of the law.
Yeah.
This you can also find in Schmidt's writing. So therefore, the cheap
Disregard.
expulsion of Schmidt is just bad Schmittian.
But the point I wanted to bring up with you is the Samaritan is clearly exposing parochial altruism,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But Ivan views it as deeply ambivalent, right?
Mhm.
So it opens the door to evil as much as it opens the door
Yeah,
to good.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's really his whole
Yeah,
idea in a
yeah,
certain way.
yeah.
That Antichrist is present with Christ at the very moment of inception, right?
Mhm.
What will prevent
Mhm.
this surprising, gratuitous act from becoming a compulsory and normative act?
And lead
So,
yeah.
So Ivan, in a certain way, spends most of his life trying to restore parochial altruism. If you look at it, I mean, that's a provocative, that's a provocative and paradoxical way of saying it.
Yeah.
Illich is about boundaries, limits, nemesis, gender, right? I'm not saying he's recommending vernacular gender. I'm not going to give a crude reading of it, but everything in that book is about complementary relationships and about the fact that always a bounded reality is necessary to really be able to imagine. Right? So people who live in the unlimited live without God because they live in the unlimited. So this is what is interesting to me about Ivan, is that he thinks so much against the paradoxical consequences of this exposure of parochial altruism, and therefore I claim that he can't be understood except as a paradoxical, contradictory, complementary
I mean,
thinker.
Yeah, you are first right, and I didn't develop that here because it would go a little bit in a new field, but a very important field and very close to Illich. This is the danger that is opened with this parable, or with the message of love of Christ. I would be very careful to say he wants to restore parochialism.
That was
Yeah, I mean there are some. So I'm not happy with his use of nemesis, and he's, from my point of view.
So you think, in fact, he does somewhat
A little bit.
succumb to that temptation?
There is a
All right.
temptation, but not only with Illich. I mean, you can find it also by other thinkers that are very dear to me. Albert Camus, who talks about nemesis, and Simon Weil, who talks about nemesis. I mean, of course, in regard to a complete dissolution of everything particular, nemesis is probably something helpful. But I think, first of all, as soon as the biblical message really undermines these parochial concepts, it's no longer possible in that sense. So the real problem, and I think we are currently really challenged exactly with this problem, because there is a kind of cosmopolitan globalism which is really destroying types of decent human life. So some of the reactions, negative reactions against this development are right. And the question is the solution to this problem going back to the parochial type? And I don't think this is the solution. A key thinker that I forgot to quote because I learned from him also a lot, and he's not a Western thinker, it's Pankaj Mishra, who wrote the book The Age of Anger. And so he really shows the justified anger against a certain kind of neoliberal globalization. And I think that goes very much together with, and he emphasized it just in the New Yorker months ago, that Gandhi's emphasis on small communities and so on is very important. But I think there is a type of smallness, small community. I actually wrote an article many years ago about Leopold Kohr, where I also said Leopold Kohr understood also small communities are better as large leviathans, but then he also has a tendency to go back to parochial altruism. There is an essay by Illich, and I have not found, at least a couple of years when I looked for it, an English translation of it. It came out in German in 1980, 1981, and it's called Über die ökumenische Verwirrung. So it's about the ecumenical we concepts. And in this concept, he warns of dissoluting globalism. So in that sense, very much what you said, David. But then he says we should think about different we's in the line of Pentecost. Mm-hmm. And Pentecost, of course, is this miracle where the people in their vernacular languages understood the common thing. Right. Well, this is not parochial altruism. This is some kind of communitarian localism that is open, of a open universalism.
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
Because I think Illich is easily misunderstood and lays himself open to that misunderstanding. Unless you understand him as a complementary thinker, so let's take Pentecost, right? Mm-hmm. The image of Pentecost was tremendously important, probably to Antonio Nebrija, to most Renaissance humanists, who saw exactly their opening, the development of vernacular languages as a new Pentecost. Ivan, if you just read his essay on Antonio Nebrija in Shadow Work, you would think he wanted everyone to stay. You could easily infer, if you were a careless reader, that he wants everyone to just stay where they are, up to their ears in sod, speaking their vernacular tongues, and never mind Nebrija and all these interfering busybodies who have a school system lurking at the back of their minds, right? Well, you can't read it that way, I don't think, right? Or to take another example, in gender, a careless reader might think that Ivan was completely against companionate marriage. I mean, that actually, you might, if you read carefully, see that he actually thinks it's glorious that Abelard and Eloise have chosen each other, but mostly he's showing you the shadow, right? He's showing you the shadow. So instead of the glory of being finally able to choose my wife or husband, we see a new form of a new economic unit emerging, a new, it's an offense to community, it's destroying community. So in his constantly bringing out of the shadow, he can easily be read as the romantic reactionary that the women of Berkeley took him for in 1982, and therefore one always has to keep the complementary element in mind, right? That he's talking about the shadow of something glorious, which he isn't mentioning. So you might not know. So and Sajay used to say that he was an esoteric writer, sometimes said it. And I think it's a good remark, because if you don't understand it, you can easily take it or assimilate it to romantic reaction. I mean, just to use the formula.
I mean, if you talk this way, I'm fully in agreement, but so your remark, he was in favor of re-establishing Baroque altruism, was your now exaggerated going into...
Yes, exactly, this thinking always of the shadow, right?
Yeah.
So, in a certain way, he's saying that this whole revelation is proceeding via its shadow, right?
Or it can be. I mean, I don't see an automatism.
No.
There's no automatism,
No,
because he hoped we can live in...
I just want to open it up to others, including Joey, but just one quick sentence before, I think, Joey and then Trent wants to say something. The limits that Illich spoke about is to preserve, if I understand it correctly, is to preserve the possibility of the Samaritan. Right? That is to say, the
That's
limits.
what I understand.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you use that phrase to protect parochial altruism in the way that you meant it, it was again an exaggeration, a provocative. David, I speak to you.
Yeah.
A provocative sort of open.
Yeah, because the whole point of a Samaritan is that he's a Samaritan. That he emerges from his homeworld into this no man's land where the wounded man lies, and his whole action is to restore him to some sort of homeworldly comfort. Well, if this becomes a norm, the homeworld is eventually eviscerated. There is no Samaritan anymore.
Yeah, but I mean, the story has...
There's the general hospital.
Yeah, but the story has more dimensions. And I am emphasizing very strongly just the broader setup, which was a provocation that contributed to the killing of Jesus. But what you said is true too, but you cannot separate that. So Illich understood we cannot...
This is what we were trying to begin to discuss about complementarity. That's what I mean by that.
I agree.
Trent, and then Joey.
Some of my closest friends travel everywhere to support the First Nations against the catastrophe that is here. They suffer a lot, and they lose their faith because of this, because of the doctrines of discovery. They are so critical that it's completely, they've lost Christian tradition totally for this. Carl Schmitt's The Nomos of the Earth is perhaps one of the most dramatic. I know David finished the book. I got to the section on doctrines of discovery, and I couldn't continue.
Nomos of the Earth.
For me, I would like to think of both Schmitt and Illich as Epimethean Christians, people who think that an understanding of the past possibly can heal the future, except they're opposites. And I'm not very clear, actually, when it comes down to Illich's point of view. about the doctrines of discovery. Because ultimately this is, for me, the frontline issue for many of my friends and for the catastrophe around us.
Yeah, in my paper, I have a critical footnote, but I didn't yet work on it. I mean, I like Schmidt for his political, for his insights, analytical insights. But I would not go with him. I would not go with Schmidt. So I think a Christian hope is profound Christian hope, like Joseph Pieper developed it, for instance. It goes deeper and further than Schmidt's Epimetian understanding of Christianity. But I have to admit, I would not be able now to make it clear. It's just whenever I came across those things that I felt this has to be laid out a little bit more closely, and that worried me a little bit in this affinity you were referring to in Illich. That worried me. I wrote a footnote, why doesn't he go stronger into a Christian understanding of hope instead of following Greek myth, which is closer to parochial altruism for my taste.
Trent, I wonder if everyone understood doctrine of discovery.
I didn't hear you.
I wonder if everyone understood the idea of doctrine of discovery.
I didn't.
As Schmidt lays it out.
The justification of the
We found it, it's ours.
of the destruction of indigenous
Yeah.
peoples, of First Nations, and a whole series of doctrines from the 13th century to the 16th century
Yeah.
that are unacceptable totally to many people in the third world.
Yeah.
There's a book against Schmidt's Nomos of the Earth from the third world that is screaming against this point of view.
I mean,
Just to clarify, which is we found it, it's virgin, it's ours. Someone.
sorry.
Gesture of
I mean,
colonization.
Yes.
what's important about Schmidt's Nomos of the Earth, Schmidt is celebrating the conquista of Latin America as the last great deed of Christians. So Schmidt himself was completely in favor of conquering Christianity in Latin America. So when I read his understanding of Jesus, the reigning, victorious, conquering Jesus, I think it's also linked to his understanding of the conquista.
Yes.
So Schmidt is, on the one hand, against globalization, on the other hand, a supporter of the worst type of Christian steps in that direction. So that, and
What
I
does
don't
Illich
think
have to
that.
say about this? I'm not clear about the doctrines of discovery.
I'm not aware that he ever said anything about it.
He's not mentioned it.
Not that I know of.
He has an essay that he hands out on discovery in the early Western history, which emphasizes curiosity, because I vaguely remember it. But that's all I know. So he's silent on this issue.
Who? Illich.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not really an Illich expert, so I cannot say.
On the issue of colonization, I mean, call it what it, right? The justification for colonization. I don't think you'll find anything in Illich that would even come close to justify. On the contrary. So the compilation of essays that comprise shadow work, I think it starts with 3 dimensions of public choice. And there is a paragraph, 2-page, on the different forms of the subject generated by Christian thinking, where the pagan, ending up with the underdeveloped, including the infidel.
Can I say something about this? Because this is a great puzzle to me. It was you who suggested I read Nomos of the Earth, and I'm grateful that I did. In Canada now, we have numerous and prestigious faculties of Indigenous law. This is a very strange putting together, right? Because law, in a certain sense, is what the Christians brought, right? Not to any good end necessarily. That's what Schmidt made me see, right? That the net of law, boundary, the Europeans imposed this on the earth, right? They imposed a state structure, legal regimes, all were imposed, right? Now what was there before is called indigenous law. So it seems to me a great confusion exists where it makes it very hard to talk, because all the concepts you could use have been taken away in the desire to make what was there before seem equal to what overtook it, overwhelmed it, oppressed it. And I'm not trying to, it's very hard to not sound like a defender of the colonial regime or a defender of missionary activity if you want to try and convince Indigenous people in Canada that what they're saying is deeply Christian and quite unthinkable in their own terms without the admixture of Christianity through missionary efforts that were at the same time utterly appalling. Residential schools, one just becomes mute trying to speak about this reality because it is complementary reality. It isn't one thing or the other. And one thing is now so glorious, so completely sacred, to speak of the other at all, unless you belong to that sort of, I know there's a school of thought that defends empire and so on, right? Right, you know, Niall Ferguson will write in favor of empire, but in the circles I move in, one is just mute. So,
We're coming together of all the indigenous groups around the world to support the protocol on advancing informed consent resulted in a book called The Original Instruction, which is in fact being handed out in my circles as the indigenous First Nation natural law, which is it's a disappointing book from a scholar's point of view, but at the same time it's an effort to articulate the understanding of people who live within the metabolism of the earth and understand that living within the metabolism of the earth has a real sustainability. I really recommend this book, The Original Instruction.
okay.
I'm interested in how Hawass and Agamben both come to this notion of resident alien. I don't know what corresponds or if they have any knowledge of each other in terms of their work, but that was an interesting insight.
Yeah, I think there is no connection. I mean, the term is in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so
But that's right.
Yeah.
They both arrive at
Yeah.
a very similar place, which I thought was interesting. And then our Pope now talks about the Pilgrim Church. That's what we have to strive to be. And what the way you framed it, which I thought was very beautiful, and David's comment about Illich, being focused on the shadow, that what being a pilgrim and what being a resident alien requires at some level is a deep sense of trust in something, and that trust in human planning is a new form of the sin of pride. So, what is the trust that is required? The trust in the here and now that I think you also said, and the trust in God that I don't think Illich articulates because he's focused on the shadow side. That I find really fascinating, and I also think that I had this conversation last night with Dana and Dom that I think the reading of the parable of the Good Samaritan is really the parable of the beaten up Jew in the ditch, that it's not about activity, it's about that total gratuitousness of something coming that was totally unexpected for the beaten up Jew in the ditch. That's not an active thing, it's actually a passive, and it's that deep trust that's being pointed out.
I mean, I said already, I think the parable of the Samaritan has different insights. And I would not lay out one against the other. So I agree with that,
yeah.
But I also emphasize that it's also, and that you can also find in Illich, it's really a challenge of very deep old patterns of social life.
Yeah, agreed.
And it's difficult to grasp that because we do not understand really what it means to be a Samaritan. So just the example that he
I agree.
Because he could also have told this story and just said there was someone in the ditch and another one helped without contextualizing it.
Agreed.
But then my point would be gone. But it's not. And it's a challenge. We had just 2 weeks ago a lecture in Princeton by one of the leading people there at Princeton University in the Religious Studies Department, Eric Gregory, and his lecture was, is there a global Samaritan? So can you globalize, universalize the parable? And of course he was a little bit making a plea for we have to rethink nationalism also as Christians, and we cannot just push it aside. I mean, it goes a little bit into what David said, what Illich observed as the shadow, but it was a little bit also diminishing the challenge of the story. So he didn't really talk about the political challenge. And there was a famous law scholar, Jeremy Waldron from New York, who gave the response, and he emphasized that. And then I knew already Waldron wrote on the Good Samaritan in a very profound way, although he's not a believer. So I do not. So I say there are several things, and what Illich strongly emphasizes is the neighbor is the one to whom I, out of love, take my attention willingly. This is the neighbor. And you cannot make out of this more basic human insight and movement. You cannot turn this into a prescription. You cannot turn this into a prescription. Although I thought it would be interesting to think this insight of Illich a little bit closer with Emmanuel Levinas, because Levinas would say, you are always already hostage of the one who needs you. So he would turn it around, and maybe it would be interesting to see if we bring those two insights together, what that means.
But I just want to follow up the thing that I'm trying to figure out, and I'm wrestling with myself, is this radical trust in the here and now. And I think we heard a couple comments about, well, ultimately is the Bible and what Illich is calling for just anarchy. And in the absence of being able to articulate or talk about, as David was talking about, that the law and all this stuff gets imposed, how do you even talk about what existed in the absence of the Western concepts that would provide a different vision of things? And that's what I'm kind of
yeah.
trying to wrestle
Although
with.
if we use the term anarchy, I mean there's a famous quote by Carl Schmitt that's for me the key to understand Schmitt really, and it's in his private diaries, in his glossarium. And I sometimes make the claim, and I think it's not completely wrong, if I take up a new book of Schmitt, I look, is this quote mentioned in this book or not? If it's not mentioned, I don't read it, because why should I read things that go, that do not address the most profound things? And this quote is the following. He says, Thomas Hobbes and the Grand Inquisitor did the same thing. De-anarchize Christianity and push Jesus to the margin as far as possible, not to not to undermine political order. And therefore, so he uses the term de-anarchize, but I would say anarchy from the point of view of someone who is completely committed to political order. This is anarchy. So if you
Sven
read,
is saying Jesus should be pushed to the margins.
yeah,
At the same time that he should be the victorious ruler. That's right. This is certainly complementarity in action.
No, but
Yeah.
with Jesus to the margins and what to the center.
yeah, but you know, the Grand Inquisitor does it.
Yeah.
So in some way, he has a new version of Jesus,
Right.
whose name is Grand Inquisitor. But if I read just one sentence, if I read Illich, because you were asking justly what is really trust, I would say Illich is not in favor of anarchism for the sake of anarchism. When he talks about communities of fraternity, of communities of fraternal love, this is not anarchy. This is a very strong commitment. This is a very relational understanding, and the trust just mean, as we express it in the Our Father prayer, give us our daily bread. So if we live in that kind, there will be a lunch coming probably, and but we always organize already 2 months, 10 years, 50 years that we have the daily bread in 50 years, and we know it today. Yeah. So that's
just to press this point a little bit, and I think I want to, for my own understanding, shift it to lunches and breakfasts and so on. You say you obey the traffic lights.
most of the time.
But one remembers that the Christians were persecuted in Rome for being irreligious. They did not obey the traffic laws.
Well, they didn't sacrifice to the right God.
I mean, they were
They
No, they show up.
did obey the traffic lights. I mean, Origen says that the Christians are better, even though we know of another and better city, that they are better disposed citizens than their pagan counterparts, according to Origen. So they're not saying that they were scofflaws.
No,
Just
I don't
didn't
mean it
perform the
literally.
right sacrifice.
They do not obey the laws of the city. That is to say, you don't behave because you insist on the here and now. But the here and now is a modality of being that puts into doubt, as you called it, parochial altruism, that puts into doubt the norms of society.
Yeah.
That is inherently challenging
But
by definition.
you know that there's a famous letter, that's the letter to Diognet. It's a very famous letter. Agamben is referring to it, and you have also the term paroikoi in it, where it is said, Christians follow the laws of the city where they live, the resident aliens. They share their food and drinks and so on. They are hospitable. They don't share their bed, which is also interesting insight, because that would probably create some troubles anyway. But they are not in the sense of a parochial attitude. So meaning they are not rooted and committed to the town, because they are sojourners. But sojourners who obey the laws of the place they are and also help the other people and so on. So I don't have the text now, but it's a very important text which shows the attitude of the early Christians.
Could I say something about complementarity?
Please.
Which is a great Derridian term, not Deleuzian term. I think we tend to forget that in the Grand Inquisitor itself, there's a complementarity insofar as the Grand Inquisitor banishes Christ, to which Christ responds with a Judas-like return of the kiss that burns in the soul of the Inquisitor. I mean, we've got to remember where that ends. So you've got a complete reconfiguration of the visceral compassion between the between the Good Samaritan and the Jew. And the other thing I wanted to say is, much of what we're talking about here seems to be summed up in Karl Marx's letter on the Jewish question. I don't know if that's widely known. The Jewish problem, the letter on the Jewish problem, and that. I mean, the claim is that look, your political identity is based on Judaism. How can you be Germans? Get out of here. And Marx actually takes up intellectually that challenge, and it's one of the most magnificent pieces. I haven't read a lot of Marx. Sajay has read much more Marx than I have, but this is absolutely mind-blowing letter, and if you ever doubt Marx's intellect, read this letter.
What is the gist of it again? What is it?
He's responding to the charge that the Jews cannot be citizens because their real allegiance will always be to other Jews.
His point is that emancipation of the Jews is limited. It has to be a universal emancipation.
Right.
That's what that letter says.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, right behind it is the expulsion of Spinoza from the Jewish community, probably as a sacrificial lamb to the Jews being cooperative to the authorities. They had to give up their best and brightest to prove that they were good citizens, and Spinoza paid the price. His cousin paid the price before him, and his cousin committed suicide, and he didn't. But they were both excommunicated from the synagogue in Amsterdam.
David.
I'd like to ask the speaker, did Illich ever promote a active kind of like revolutionary theology as opposed to, it seems like he had this idea of going back to some original kind of pristine religion. I mean, he seems to have not engaged with American Protestant kind of like revolutionary-oriented denominations. Just because a religious force, you know, kind of gets strong, and it doesn't have just two paths. You know, you gave the example of parochial nationalism, and then you also said the Constantinian temptation. But some religious faiths or bodies, they percolate and they break off and form another denomination. And it seems like it's all or nothing with Illich. So what I'm asking is, does he have a clear path for those religious groups or fragments that keeps them religious, but also helps them engage or try to develop kind of revolutionary politics?
Before you answer, can I ask you to say more what you mean about all or nothing?
I'm sorry?
Can you say more what you mean that it seems to you that it's all or nothing for Illich?
Well, for Illich, I mean, he knows a lot about, he knows a little bit about a lot of things. But he didn't seem to know a lot about the power of religion to try to take on, you know, the state. He was critical, you know, that's why we read him. But when it comes to dealing with taking down, you know, oppression and building something new, he kind of jumps to another, you know, area. I mean, this is my reading, you know, we're all different. So, I mean, he deals with hospitals and education and this and that, jumps around. But he doesn't really give the readers or his followers much, any kind of weapons to deal with, you know, direct oppression. I mean, in his later writings, and I don't know what he did in Puerto Rico and such. So I'm just curious, did he ever promulgate a proactive, clear path or set of principles that religious adherents could kind of shoot toward? You mentioned Kavanaugh, people like that. I can mention other theologians who spent their life writing very clear kind of tracts and such as to which way the country needed to go. Martin Luther King, Chaos or Community. The whole book is about politics and religion. So I'm just curious, you know, what's your thinking on?
Probably I'm not
best guy to ask this question. I mean, what I read and what I understood is that he sees the danger of being drawn too strongly into a just political pattern. So the one quote that I read makes that very clear. He had also some, another quote that I didn't read. So we must ask ourselves how we can provide the things, the events, the people to which somebody called by the Lord needs success if he wants to approach Christ, leaving it up to the Lord to show those who come after us how these things happen in our generation. In short, we must abandon, in this case, the ideal of both the social scientists and the Marxists of being able to write a history of the future in the present. So he was a little bit, he saw a little bit the danger of some of those revolutionary attempts, and also saw the danger that people really want to get too strongly caught up in political things and forget the deeper spiritual roots. I don't know, did he ever address Martin Luther King and the whole question? I mean, I don't know.
He was an admirer of King.
Yeah.
But I don't think he did. But can I try and answer?
Sorry.
I think what Wolfgang says is important, that he, from the beginning, felt that there was something that must be kept out of politics, right? An idea of the church as an atmosphere, a form of communion, a manifestation of something that can never be fully incarnate in the world. So that's true. But I also think he was, and he said so, a proscriptive, not a prescriptive thinker. So he was not interested in saying things to people about how they should organize or how they should carry on. What he was interested in doing was clearing space, right? So if you take the schooling example, if you were to disestablish schooling, right? So no one is required now to have schooling in order to exercise other prerogatives. Then what would happen? How would people organize that? For him, they would be freed from the illusion that this was the way to salvation, right? Outside the church, no salvation. Outside the school, no job, no path in life, right? Everyone focuses on this, right? Puts all their energy into it, makes it more and more powerful. He was trying, and that I think was what he was mainly trying to do, was to, so he was an iconoclast, he was clearing space without ever thinking, and all his writings are occasional. They're limited to some occasion that he wants to address, not...
Or had to address.
Or had to address.
And he was asked to.
Yeah, but not ever really telling people how, the positive, let's say, and we call this the negative. So I think
Limit their freedom.
he's with you, but just as a kind of bushwhacker who's trying to clear some space for the things that I think you're talking about.
Yeah, but you want to make sure that if he's with us, that he doesn't take us down the wrong path. And because we live in an active society. We're not all professors and book lovers and things of that sort. I mean, we're all kinds of people, and I think this is a problem. When I engage with Illich with respect to religion, because as you said at the beginning of your lecture, religion is a dominant, if not the dominant, influence in terms of political dimension. So that right there offers a heck of a challenge. And if Illich is taking on this challenge, if his writings have, we as 2018 people, whatever, we want to make sure it's correct. We can look at the Arab Spring, where everyone kind of exposed, but you had no protection for these students and these outspoken working people and such. And look what happened. So I would like to see Illich in his material, and this is why we're here, and look at different essays and publications, we would like to see if he gives us more than just making us aware, that we're being...
Yeah, but now it came something to my mind that's very important, and just supporting what David said. I think that's very important, because if we do not understand that, we read him not properly. He was part of the left. So when you read that, I mean, I myself understand myself in a very broad sense as a Christian socialist, what does not mean that I vote for the Socialist Party in Austria, but this is a more complicated thing. But as I said, I also do not want to juxtapose Metz over against Illich or so. So this concern for social justice, for fighting oppression and so on, I mean, this is very important. And when I read Illich, I think he's completely part of the left. So there's no question about that he would be, that he's against oppression and so on. So the question is, and that's interesting, he addresses some problems that we have in the left. I mean, I identify myself with the left. But we should be also aware of all the dangers that come along with what we are doing. I mean, I refer to Nicaragua, and one of the most striking things, and it's so funny. I mean, when you see that, I think I read it in one of the books of David. All the revolutionaries, really the left-wing critical thinkers, tried to come to Cuernavaca in Mexico and stay some weeks or months with him and learn from him. And when they wrote letters, if they are allowed to come, he said, yeah, they are allowed to come, but there is a requirement. And the requirement was, there was a church historian, actually from Austria in the United States, Gerhard Ladner, who wrote a book, The Idea of Reform. And he said they have to read this book, or at least a chapter of this book. I bought it myself 5 years ago, the book, and read it. And it's a very deeply mystical, spiritual understanding of church reform in the early church fathers, and the book ends with Augustine. And when you see that, you ask yourself, what was Illich doing when he said to those left-wing revolutionaries joining him in his battle to read this book? And I think this gives a little bit an answer to your question in that sense, that this deeper kind of, so if you engage against oppression, if you do all those things, we have to be aware of the deeper commitment, the deeper orientation of yourself. And this is more in the line of Augustine and what I said today, have a trustful life. Don't try to control everything. Because when you do that, you end up like the Nicaraguan revolution. And you could also think about the Arab Spring. I mean, of course, I'm not in favor of the coup that ended the regime of Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood. But they also made a big mistake. First of all, the Brotherhood was not really deeply involved in the Arab Spring, but then they later joined. And of course there were many people, because they were religious people, that we would rather go with them, with Morsi, and they won tremendous success in the election. But then they established their regime in a way that after 3 or 4 months, half of the population was completely upset and made the coup possible. And if they would have gone in a more detached sense, from inner sense, and did it much more carefully and not threaten all the things, probably we would have in Egypt a situation like in Tunisia where it worked out. Also because the Tunisian Muslim, they understood we have to come to terms with the seculars, and we have, if we try to win the elections and then make our harsh regime and take complete control, that will just have the counterproductive reaction that we will be wiped away, and then for the next decades there's nothing. So I think Illich, as I read him, is a person from the left, but he addresses the shadows of the left in a very important way, because we have sometimes I say myself, I mean, would it be much better if we would run the state and the government? I know some of my friends quite well and know myself quite well. I mean, as soon as we would be challenged and have something done wrong, we would probably try to avoid that, and because we are the good people, and the good people have more difficulty to accept their failures as those who lie all the time. I mean, the liars, they know they are liars and they are corrupt people, but if the good people are in charge, it can be very dangerous, because the good people have problems. And I think this Illich understood. This Illich understood.
I have time. Oh, sorry, Dana.
No,
Go ahead. And two questions. Dana and Carl wanted to ask. You pass. Dana, please.
I know we're about to end, but I was hoping that, or I was wondering if Illich's understanding of philia is pertinent to this conversation. I wondered if you had anything to say about it. Politics of friendship in the face of oppression, in the face of the dissolution of institutions or state structures or whatever.
Yeah,
I don't have the answer.
No, I mean, that's his concept of love, his understanding of love is very important, but it's again, you have to take it in a broader sense, and I just want to add one more sentence. I just read this morning a little chapter on his challenging address to the schooling religious orders, the Jesuits and all the orders who did schooling, and she said, soon you will have to be part of the deschooling attempt. I mean, the prediction was completely wrong, because there is schooling going on. But the interesting thing is, just to make, again, strong your claim, the reason why he was so much in favor of deschooling, because he saw it doesn't really help the poor people. So, and does it help today? We have a huge academia and schools and everything, but we also create dropouts day by day. And today those people who are dropouts, they are even worse than in traditional societies, because in traditional societies you would say they were unlucky. But in a modern society you would say, well, there were all the opportunities were open for you. You could probably end up in Harvard and be a great person, and maybe you were lazy or whatever. So it's your fault. So Illich's challenging critique of schooling was because he saw schooling is not helping the poor, despite the attempt that they legitimate all the things they do in that regard. I think that's also important insight. That many institutions that help the poor need the poor in order to justify their good incomes, their good bureaucratic jobs, but do they really help the poor? One can doubt. And that's a question. I mean, when I read Illich, just to say that when I read Illich, it's not that I read it and said, yeah, that's right, that's how I am. I'm not like that. I am completely in security, and so for me it's also a challenge that I say is the way I conduct my life, is that really a proper thing, or is it also on the other side, completely institution, traveling all over the world and talking about one should not travel all over the world, and one should be committed to the poor and so on. And I think Illich saw that. Even he himself was a little bit contradictory, because he also traveled all over the world and talked about the danger of modern traveling. But at least he was aware of that even we good people should be very well aware of all the problems that are going together with what we do. But as I understand, his attempt to criticize schooling was because he saw that those who are really left out are the poor, despite all the claims. And that, I think, is very important to understand. So sorry that the philia, I mean...
Can I quickly
call it
I just want to speak to Dana about this, because I think you know, when the questions are posed in a big way, right? Well, if he's in favor of freedom, you know, what about order? What about the ecological crisis? We're obviously going to need huge bureaucratic regime, you know, et cetera. And then you're lost in abstraction, right? Two vast abstractions battle each other, and who knows who wins. But philia, love, moves person to person. And where it goes, nobody knows until it is attempted, until the friendships are built, so the world changes one step at a time in this or that place, and that, you know, that you don't know what it is going to be until it actually emerges, if the system allows it to emerge, which generally it doesn't. I mean, my personal experience here, my wife Yuda would rather go to Pittsburgh to see a bake oven than listen to us batter gums here. But she worked for 20 years in this park building this very interesting thing, which the city of Toronto then squashed. Because they didn't recognize any of the elements of it. They couldn't see how she had the authority that she had. What position did she occupy? They couldn't recognize any of the vernacular elements in it. They couldn't recognize how it was done. It wasn't done through a plan. It was done with people one step at a time, making these new kinds of institutions that aren't quite institutions in their sense. They couldn't see it. The love, if you call it that, was invisible to them. They see like a state, as James Scott says. So I think this is always terra incognita, right? We don't know what it's going to be until what Joey is building in his union, or what I was building at the CDC, or what you're doing in your world, or any other example. We're making these living things that probably get squashed. And one reason they get squashed is because they don't have any recognized name or standing or anything that they can prevent their own crucifixion by. So that's a bit strong at the end there, so.
Yeah, on that happy note, question. Are you sure, Carl, you didn't have the last question? We break and rejoin the festivities at 4 o'clock. Yes? Back in this room.
Nice.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Wolfgang.
Yeah.